Everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoterica on our April Fool's episode this year, because if you saw the title, I said the NUON was the best console you've ever played, and while I do not plan on tearing it apart in any way, shape, or form, that is a lie, because it's definitely not the best console you've ever played. I had an idea to do a video for today, whether or not I'm better or worse at light gun games when drunk, and I did not have time to make that, but if you want to see it, leave me a comment down below and I'll get to it in the future. Before we get too far involved, like and subscribe, all that jazz, Patreon link down below. Let's get into the NUON itself, because I've been getting a lot of requests for NUON content. And you'll see here I'm using a Toshiba SD2300, and the only way you would know that this is a NUON is this small logo right here on the front, and if we open up that door you're going to see two controller ports. Now this was given to me by a viewer of the channel. I just covered shipping, so thanks to him. I'll leave his name and the thanks down below. But the controllers are the worst part about the NUON. Not that they're that bad, but they're impossible to find. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But you'll see here, because the NUON is just a standard typical DVD player of the era, it's got the standard accoutrement of buttons on the front, and of course it's going to use DVD media for both movies and the games. Now I burnt these on Staples branded DVDRs, and it worked perfectly fine. Your mileage may vary, who knows. And you'll see here that it was manufactured in January of 2001, and this is at the height of DVD. In 2001, I looked at the stats, they sold 13 million DVD players, and that's why NUON was genius in concept, because if you did even 10% with NUON in it, that's a 1.3 million install base for your hardware. And the hardware is good because it's in a DVD player. You're going to get composite, component, and S-video out, so the NUON is going to look great on your television. Everything made sense for the NUON. The hardware was decent, and the Trojan horse aspect of getting a game console into a DVD player was quite smart. It is rumored that Sony decided that they had to ship a DVD player in the PlayStation 2 because NUON was getting a lot of press in gaming magazines when it was introduced as Project X. And this right here is a NUON. We will go over the board in a lot more depth coming up, and I'll talk about some games later on in the video. But this was hardware that was hyped so heavily in magazines, they called it the Nintendo killer. It started out as Project X. And the interesting thing is basically the NUON was done. Obviously you can buy consoles for it. And it is interesting that all of the buttons go right through that NUON board, this one manufactured by Toshiba. And the issue with the NUON was that by the time it was ready to launch, the company was basically out of money, so they had no opportunity to market it. It was a great idea with decent hardware inside of a box, but when it finally got to market, the company was basically bankrupt, and it arrived on shelves without any fanfare and was gone that quickly as well. And you'll just see here the video board goes right through the NUON as well. I kind of expected to see a NUON expansion card in a DVD player in and of itself, but it is just that everything, including the controller ports here, run right back to that board with the NUON chip on it, and that was what this was. Different manufacturers could design their own DVD players around the NUON chipset, and for Toshiba at least, they made one board with a NUON on it. I've seen some Samsung models where the NUON board is an expansion card, and as far as reliability is concerned, they don't seem to break that off from what I've talked to collectors about. All the capacitors on the power supply are of a nice quality, and everything looks good for a 21-year-old console. This thing is old enough to drink. But let's get the NUON board out of the DVD case in and of itself, because that is the most interesting thing here. And at least on this model, you've got a lot of ribbon cables. They all seem to be nice and fine, not brittle at all, so just make sure you're careful when you pop them out. There were no retention tabs. They are just press fits. And there's 4 screws around the corner. Pinch these 2 little plastic tabs right here, and the NUON brain pops right out. So let's see what is on the board in and of itself. Obviously the NUON is this chip right here. A lot of what's around it is mixed hardware for DVD functionality, because DVDs are both a video format and in some small ways an operating system in and of themselves. So of course you're going to have chipsets for both the NUON hardware and the DVD portion as well, and there is an interesting little blank spot there for another chip. And if we take a look on the bottom, we have an analog devices, probably digital to analog signal converter, and just a couple other chips. Honestly, there's not a lot to look at with the NUON hardware. You'll see that one is marked with a little bit of red. I believe that is the BIOS on board here right now, or some flash ROM storage. But the NUON chip on the front of this board is the most interesting thing, because that is what's making games actually function, and their specification sheet for this is quite vague. It is a 128-bit processor, and they came in 2 different CPU speed packages, although the speed of the CPU doesn't seem to affect the games whatsoever. And right now we're taking a look at Merlin Racing. Now, the NUON was developed in part by ex-Atari employees, and a lot of people think of this as the Jaguar 2 because a lot of the engineers that worked on NUON worked on the Jaguar platform. And I would say that for 2001, this looks okay. I mean, we're looking at like maybe Nintendo 64 times 2. The textures really remind me of the Nintendo 64, and this has 2 GPUs on the die. I do not know what company made them. It just says Media GL, and I could not really find many references to them on the internet. So the spec sheet here is very limited. I can't point to something and say there is the ability to push 2 million polygons a second fully textured. That just doesn't seem to be happening. But what is on screen right now, I'd probably say is like 500 to 700,000 polygons a second. That is just an estimate. Now you will see that I am controlling this, and I am playing relatively poorly, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But you will see here when we go into some of the more complex stages and right up on this little curb here, the textures look relatively good. They're filtered nicely. They're definitely less blurry than a Nintendo 64, and the NUON did come with 32 megabytes of DRAM, so I think that the texture cache is probably larger. Now, the issue with the NUON, which I mentioned earlier, is the control scheme. It is not good because I don't have a controller. I am playing all these games via the Toshiba remote. Now, each NUON that shipped did not come with a controller in box, so each game had to, in part, function with the DVD remote by spec, and some of these buttons I'm pushing here are the ones that you use. The problem is developers did not adhere to that, so some games are completely not playable with the DVD remote, and some games only work in part. Now, this is why I'm doing this video on April 1st and talking about it, because if you really want to see more NUON videos, you need to leave a comment and let me know, because I'm going to have to borrow a controller from someone, because NUON controllers go for multiple hundreds of dollars, and the polyface chip inside of the controllers themselves have not been reverse engineered, so there are no adapters to plug into a NUON to play these games properly. So if you really want to see a series of videos on the NUON, tell me below and I will try to find a controller, but I did not go out hunting for one until I know if there is actually enough interest in this. Well, moving over to something like Free Fall, if the NUON looked like this in actual gameplay, this would have been spectacular for 2001, and it has the look that maybe it could be, but you really notice quickly that this is just a pre-rendered FMV video playing before the game starts. But whoever made this game loved it because they put a lot of time and money into making this intro, and it does look relatively talented and skilled. Unfortunately, when we jump over to the game itself, you're going to see that the graphical quality diminishes very greatly. But it is hard to say what the NUON was capable of because it only has a handful of games, and these were not, AAA developers working on it. This looks decent, but it also looks like something that could be on the PlayStation 1, and you'll see here, this is the native size of the screen output via component to my capture device and upscaled via a FrameMeister. But through the magic of video editing, I'm going to fill the screen out completely. I would be disappointed if that was the image I got on my TV back in the day. Now maybe it's something with the capture card, but even here you'll see it just doesn't look that spectacular. But my guess is that the NUON chip is capable of much more than you're seeing on screen, and had this taken off and had developers had more of a time to work with the silicon and the SDK, you would have seen games that probably look close to launch game PlayStation 2 titles. Now that is just a presumption. But let's move over to Tempest now that I'm dead. Tempest 3000 is the killer app for the NUON, and it is why a lot of people collect it. The game looks visually spectacular. I love the colors and I love the music. And since this is a video about the NUON and Tempest and everything else, I will give you guys like 30 seconds of soundtrack in just a little bit. But this is just a shot across the bow video to see if you want more NUON stuff. But like I said, Tempest 3000 soundtrack spectacular. Enjoy. Fun game, great soundtrack, and if you want to see me review this in full, leave me that comment down below and I will try to find a NUON controller. And if you're watching this and you have a spare, I am very trustworthy. If I can borrow it, I will probably make some videos about the NUON, because I do have some interest in this platform from a historical standpoint, and maybe I could do a video about the entire history of VM Labs and how this hardware was developed, because this is just a fun April 1st video to gauge that interest, because it takes a lot of time and energy to make these videos, and I really don't want to make a series of 6 or 8 NUON videos if no one's really wanting to watch them. But yeah, that is a brief April 1st look history at the NUON hardware. Do me a huge favor, hit like and subscribe, and if you want to see more, you know what to do. Happy April Fools, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye bye, NUON.